Could a single company completely destroy a country's economy? In this video, we'll look at the story of broken promises, corruption, and environmental and economic disaster. And at the centre of it all is Shell, an oil behemoth that's been in business since 1907. The company did everything in its power to squeeze every last drop of money from the African nation of Nigeria, one of the poorest countries in the world, leaving behind a trail of devastation. The Royal Dutch Shell Group first set foot in Nigerian land in 1936. At the time, Nigeria was still a colony of the United Kingdom, and still 2 decades away from conquering independence. And it wasn't until 1958 that the first oil shipment finally left the country, giving everyone a taste of the sweet oil money, the seed for the chaos that would overwhelm Nigeria for decades to come. After finally becoming independent from the UK, Nigeria was determined to finally start benefiting from all the natural resources the country possessed. But they had a major problem on their path. Years of colonial exploitation left the nation with little to no technological development, meaning that they had none of the infrastructure and know-how to properly extract their resources on their own. But Shell had all of those things right there. They've been doing that for years. So, at the time, it seemed like a great deal to continue working with the company. After all, they already had all the equipment and logistics in place to continue extracting oil and putting it on the market. In April 1973, the partnership is officially formed, and the government of Nigeria takes a stake in the company's operations inside the country. Over time, the Nigerian National Petroleum Corporation would come to own 55% of the operations. 15% was spread between other European countries, and the remaining 30% would stay firmly in the hands of Shell. But despite the favourable split, all the supposed profits from the government's stake will barely make a dent in offsetting the rampant poverty inside the country, and hundreds of thousands in Nigeria will suffer due to the oil fields, but more on that later. Right now, just keep in mind that despite not owning the biggest slice of the pie, Shell would remain the operator and have free reign over the oil fields. Of course, this is where the troubles will start piling up, creating an avalanche of affliction for all that stood in the way of Shell and the company's oil profits. Before we move on, I need to introduce you to the Niger Delta. You see, deltas have been majorly important for human civilization. Agriculture production usually thrives in these wetlands, and because of that, big population centres end up forming all around them. It's no different in Nigeria's Niger Delta. It's an area that makes up roughly 7.5% of Nigeria's landmass. It's densely populated and home to various indigenous groups that have depended on fishing and farming the rich soil that the delta has offered them throughout their entire existence. And it's also been a hotbed for colonial activity. Once a major producer of palm oil for the British Empire, the region has spent most of its modern history at the hands of European colonial masters, which, as we know, have a tendency to take everything that they can without caring for giving anything in return. Anyway, this is where I'm getting at. The Delta is home to over 30 million people and at least 40 different ethnic groups that speak over 250 distinct dialects. Pretty crazy. It's also where most of the country's oil is located. As I've mentioned, these people are no strangers to colonial exploitation and having all their country's riches taken away right in front of their eyes. But after finally becoming independent, it was impossible to not feel at least a glimmer of hope. Nigeria would have a chance to make its own destiny. All of the money made from the oil in the Niger Delta wouldn't just vanish into bank accounts thousands of miles away, right? And yes, jobs were created indeed. For a while, basic infrastructure showed signs of improvement, and Shell made a point of shining a spotlight on every good deed. So what is this video about after all? Well, as you've probably already guessed, the years following the partnership agreement that gave Shell full control of the oil operations were, in reality, disastrous for the people of Nigeria, especially those living in the Niger Delta. Not only were the investments in the region not nearly enough to combat the country's main issues like poverty, disease and hunger, but Shell's operation devastated the Niger Delta and compromised the land that millions depended on. more than 7,000 oil spills between 1970 and 2000, industrial accidents, gas flares, and general pollution decimated the fish stocks and contaminated the once highly fertile soil. Even the water supplies are now filled with cancer-causing substances. Entire communities could only sit and watch as their livelihoods were destroyed. The promises of investments and a better life are nowhere to be seen, and families are left wondering how they're going to put food on the table. Of course, it's to be expected that this unsustainable situation would enrage the people of Nigeria, who finally took to the streets in massive protests. Led by the Ogoni people of southeastern Nigeria, thousands took to the streets in response to years of environmental destruction, and they weren't just looking to put an end to the oil spills, but also demanding a fair split of the wealth generated by Shell's oil extraction and activities inside the country. Want to take a guess on how these peaceful protests were met? If guns and grenades were your answer, you're correct. In one of the biggest protests, the police and military ended up killing 80 people and burning down over 500 homes. A shockingly violent response against the country's most vulnerable communities. If you're wondering what could have possibly motivated this horrendous act, the answer is, of course, money. It turns out that there were people in Nigeria getting a big share of the oil money after all, and they were the top politicians, high-ranked military officials, and pretty much anyone in a position of power. Those guys were sitting pretty while the common people were having their livelihoods destroyed, drinking polluted water, and literally swimming through crude oil to get back home. When it came to securing its billion-dollar oil operations in Nigeria, Shell did not play around. They knew that the people wouldn't stand for the environmental damage forever, so they got ahead of the problem and allegedly started a giant corruption scheme. They filled the pockets of heads of state and military leaders, and now Shell's problems were their problems too. All throughout the 90s, anywhere protests broke out, the Nigerian military was quick to violently stomp it. Every time, there would be more death and ruthless destruction. Allegedly, Shell even supplied better equipment to the military to make them more effective in squashing the protests. Now, all these protests were bad for business. Some groups were even successful in sabotaging oil plants and stopping them for a while. So, in a brutal attempt to crush the spirit of the protesters, Ken Saro-Wiwa, an activist and one of the main community leaders organising the demonstrations, was executed after having 4 murders allegedly pinned on him. Ken Saro-Wiwa was convicted in court for those murders, but after his execution, a witness for the prosecution has come out and said that he was bribed to lie against Saro-Wiwa, putting the whole trial in question and causing even more revolt among the people. But there was simply no denying it. Shell had completely taken over the country of Nigeria. Not only was the nation completely dependent on the oil company to keep extracting the oil, which is their main export, but Shell also allegedly had the most powerful leaders in the country in their pockets, looking out for their interests. Shell's deeds in Nigeria are almost comic book villain evil. It almost feels like a very deliberate plan from the start. A plan to keep the profits coming non-stop at the expense of everything else. So here's the blueprint. First, make a vulnerable nation economically dependent on your infrastructure and resources. For good measure, bribe your way into completely owning the government and transform the military into your personal militia, just to make sure you'll be safe even if you completely wreak havoc in the country. There you go, you'll be completely untouchable. So what's going on right now? These days, the fighting has been mostly happening inside the courts, with activists suing Shell both in the Netherlands and the UK. In fact, Shell has been ordered to pay over $100 million to communities affected by the oil spills. There's even a $1.9 billion case still pending, so it's likely that the company will have to continue to pay a lot of money in the years to come. But despite having had to pay millions to protesters' families and to those affected by the oil spills, Shell denies any wrongdoing in the atrocities committed by the military or that it had bribed officials. And let's be real, the millions they had to pay so far are not even a drop in the bucket compared to all the profits from decades of operating inside the country. There is still a long, long way to go if we hope to see anything that resembles justice coming out of this saga. To add salt to the wound, in 2019, a $1 billion cleanup of Ogoni land, one of the places most affected by the oil spills, was announced and funded by Shell. At the time, the ambitious project was supposed to set an example and begin the efforts to clean up the entire Niger Delta. Unfortunately, a report by Bloomberg that came out in August 2022 revealed that actually making the area even dirtier due to terrible mismanagement, waste, and lack of transparency. Apparently, the cleanup contracts were given to companies who don't have any experience or really know what they're doing. If only Shell had put the same effort into the cleanup as they did into destroying the place. This is a history that is hard to end on a good note right now. The court cases are piling up, sure, but these things move slowly, and the vast majority of people affected won't ever see a dime of compensation money. Not that money would wipe out Shell's past offences anyway, but we do hope that in the future more communities get something out of the cases and that the money is used to build the basic infrastructure that many are going without to this day. As for attempts to clean up the oil spills and return the Niger Delta to its former glory, well, $1 billion still wasn't good enough. So for now, it's still a matter of waiting for the right set of experts to take this gigantic task into their hands. As always, thank you very much for watching. Leave us a like if you enjoyed this video, and stay tuned for more to come.